If you get a toothache today, you call a dentist. You make an appointment, you sit in a comfortable leather chair, someone numbs your jaw with a localized anesthetic, and a highly trained professional fixes the problem using sterile titanium tools while asking you questions you literally cannot answer because there are 3 metal instruments and a vacuum tube in your mouth. It is an inconvenience. But if you got a severe toothache 20,000 years ago, you didn't have a dentist. You just had a rotting rock embedded in your skull that sent shockwaves of excruciating pain directly into your brain every single time your heart beat. You couldn't chew, you couldn't sleep, you couldn't focus on hunting or foraging. In a prehistoric world where your survival depended entirely on your physical output, a bad tooth wasn't just painful. It was a massive, life-threatening liability. So, what did you do? Did you bang it with another rock? Did you ask the village shaman to perform an exorcism on your mouth? Did you just accept your fate, decide that chewing was a luxury you no longer needed, and start swallowing your mammoth meat whole like a pelican? The answer to this question sounds like it should be a horror story about crude stone tools, desperate measures, and unbearable prehistoric agony. But the truth is actually one of the most fascinating biological mysteries in human evolutionary history. And by the time we are done here, you are never going to look at a loaf of bread or your own jawline the same way again. Let's go. First, we need to completely erase the image you have of a prehistoric caveman. When movies and pop culture show early humans, they usually picture them with missing, rotting, completely destroyed teeth. We assume that because they didn't have toothbrushes or mint-flavored fluoride or a hygienist named Brenda aggressively telling them they need to floss more, their mouths must have been an absolute disaster zone. But here is the shocking truth. Ancient hunter-gatherers actually had incredibly straight, near-perfect, cavity-free teeth. If you look at the fossilized skulls of humans from 20,000, 50,000, or 100,000 years ago, their dental records are pristine. Their teeth are perfectly aligned. They don't have impacted wisdom teeth. They didn't need braces. And most importantly, dental decay, the exact thing that sends you crying to the dentist today, was practically non-existent.
To understand why their teeth were so perfect while ours are a mess, we have to look at what they were actually doing with their mouths. For the vast majority of human history, our ancestors were hunter-gatherers. Their diet was wildly diverse and incredibly tough. They ate meat, organ meats like liver and kidney, seasonal fruits, nuts, roots, and tough fibrous plants. Eating this diet was a full-time biological workout. They weren't sipping smoothies or eating bread that dissolves the second it hits your tongue. Ancient humans spent hours every single day aggressively chewing raw or minimally cooked foods. And this is where the biomechanics of the human skull come into play. When you chew heavily and constantly from a very young age, the mechanical stress actually triggers your jawbone to grow wider and stronger. Because ancient humans were constantly chewing tough foods, their jawbones grew massive enough to comfortably fit all 32 of their adult teeth, including their wisdom teeth. Today, our food is soft, it's processed, it's cooked to mush, it's pre-cut. Because modern humans don't put any mechanical stress on our jaws during childhood, our jawbones literally do not grow large enough to fit all our teeth. That is why your wisdom teeth get impacted. That is why teenagers need braces. We have the exact same number of teeth as our ancient ancestors, but we are trying to cram them into a much smaller, underdeveloped modern jaw. It's basically the biological equivalent of trying to parallel park an SUV in a compact space. But it wasn't just the straightness of their teeth, it was the complete lack of cavities, and that comes down to the microbiome of the mouth. The bacteria that cause cavities, specifically Streptococcus mutans, feed almost entirely on simple sugars and refined carbohydrates. If you aren't eating sugars and heavy carbs, those bacteria starve. They cannot colonize your teeth. For hundreds of thousands of years, the human mouth was an incredibly stable ecosystem. It was a biological fortress. So, if ancient humans didn't get cavities, why do we? Why is it that the modern human mouth is a biological disaster that requires thousands of dollars of metal wires, plastic retainers, and drilling just to function correctly? To answer that, we have to talk about one of the biggest, most disruptive transitions in human history, the Neolithic Revolution, the switch from hunting and gathering to farming. Between roughly 6,000 and 10,000 years ago, humans made a choice. We decided we were tired of chasing our dinner across the African savanna or the Eurasian steppe. We figured out how to domesticate plants. We built permanent settlements. When humans transitioned to agriculture, their diet changed completely and permanently.
Farming populations stopped eating a diverse, tough diet of wild game and fibrous plants. Farming populations ate mostly cereals, wheat, barley, oats, rye, and carbohydrates. In other words, we invented a diet built almost entirely on grain. From an evolutionary perspective, this was a massive biological shock. Carbohydrates, once you start chewing them, immediately begin breaking down into simple sugars right there in your mouth. You know that stable, cavity-free ecosystem our ancestors enjoyed for 300,000 years? The agricultural revolution dropped a nuclear bomb on it. When you introduced massive, daily amounts of grain carbohydrates to the human mouth, you essentially threw a giant, never-ending frat party for the tiny minority of acid-producing bacteria living on our teeth. Suddenly, these bacteria had an unlimited food supply. They gorged on the carbohydrates, multiplied rapidly, and began producing lactic acid as a byproduct. That acid sat on the teeth, dissolving the hard enamel shield that had protected our ancestors for millennia. Widespread dental decay began. Almost overnight, in evolutionary terms, archaeological sites show a massive spike in human skulls with rotting teeth, abscesses, and severe bone loss in the jaw. Suddenly, having a rock in your head that caused agonizing pain wasn't a rare anomaly. It was a societal crisis. We traded the health of our mouths for the security of knowing exactly where our dinner was coming from. But the truly wild part of this story is that ruining our teeth wasn't the only thing the agricultural revolution broke. The switch to farming fundamentally rewired our entire biology in ways we are still dealing with today. Let's look at vitamin D. When our ancestors were hunter-gatherers, they naturally absorbed massive amounts of dietary vitamin D from eating things like fatty fish, liver, and animal products. But when farming communities switched to eating mostly wheat and barley, their dietary vitamin D intake didn't just drop, it collapsed. Suddenly, human populations that had migrated to Northern Europe, areas with long winters and weak sunlight, were almost entirely dependent on whatever vitamin D their skin could manufacture. And if their skin was still fairly dark, the melanin was blocking the very UV rays they desperately needed to synthesize that vitamin D. Without it, their calcium absorption dropped, their bones weakened, and children developed rickets. The selection pressure for lighter skin intensified dramatically. Within just a few thousand years, human skin in these northern farming communities rapidly depigmented and became white, just to absorb enough weak sunlight to keep their bones from softening and failing. Natural selection is basically a very slow, very ruthless optimization algorithm. Evolution doesn't send newsletters, it doesn't care about your smile, and it doesn't care about aesthetics. It just ruthlessly adapts to the inputs. The exact same agricultural shift that completely changed human skin color and caused ancient bones to weaken is the exact same shift that turned our mouths into cavity-producing factories. Every single shade of human skin today and every single cavity in your mouth is a direct biological response to the environment our ancestors chose to live in. So once the farming revolution happened, the enamel wore away, and toothaches became a universal human experience, how did our ancestors handle the pain? Because the human drive to alter our reality and find medicine is incredibly ancient. Long before modern medicine, ancient humans were finding ingenious, occasionally terrifying ways to deal with biological pain. In ancient Egypt, doctors weren't just sitting around waiting for teeth to rot. They were actively documenting treatments. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest known medical documents in the world, dates to ancient Egypt around 1550 BC. While it famously documents gynecological treatments and the inhalation of herbal smoke for lung conditions, the ancient Egyptians were also highly practical. They were a civilization that invented calendars, architecture, and surprisingly, early dental fillings, which is very on brand for Egypt. Archaeologists have found ancient skulls with teeth that were carefully drilled to drain painful abscesses. In other parts of the ancient world, like a Neolithic graveyard in Pakistan, researchers have found teeth with perfectly round holes drilled into them using tiny flint drill bits over 9,000 years ago. In places like modern-day Slovenia, they found a 6,500-year-old jawbone where a massive cavity was packed and filled with beeswax, basically the Neolithic equivalent of putting duct tape over your car's check engine light. And for the pain itself, our ancestors were master herbalists. Across ancient traditions, they relied on accumulated empirical knowledge of plants. They used herbs that contained compounds with measurable physiological effects: chamomile, ginger, cinnamon, fennel. And when the pain was too much, they had another tool:
getting absolutely blasted on psychoactive smoke. Across virtually every human culture ever documented, people have sought out ways to alter their consciousness. Ancient humans deliberately sought out medicinal plants, inhaling the smoke of cannabis or specific herbs around fires to numb pain and change their mental states. The ancient Greeks used therapeutic smoke regularly. Hippocrates himself wrote about the inhalation of herbal vapors. If you had a rotting tooth in ancient Mesopotamia or Greece, your best bet was likely a combination of herbal fumigation, intense natural painkillers, packing the tooth with wax, and desperately hoping it fell out before the infection spread to your brain. They figured it out because they had to.
Which brings us back to you, standing in your bathroom tonight, staring at the mirror while you brush your teeth for exactly 2 minutes. We tend to look at brushing, flossing, and mouthwash as just a boring modern chore, a baseline level of hygiene we have to perform so our breath doesn't scare people away. But it's actually a biological patch for an evolutionary mistake. You are a soft, slightly hairless bipedal ape who was perfectly evolved to chew tough roots and wild game. Your jaw was designed to be a biological powerhouse. But because your ancestors decided 10,000 years ago that planting wheat was easier than chasing a mammoth, your diet fundamentally changed. You started eating foods your mouth was never evolved to process. We built a civilization that partially decouples our biology from its original function. Every time you get a cavity, every time you get a toothache, every time you pay a dentist to fix your smile, you are paying the biological tax of the agricultural revolution. You're participating in something far older than you realize. You're fighting a 10,000-year-old battle between the ancient, pristine mouth you were genetically meant to have and the soft, sugar-loaded modern world you actually live in. So maybe floss tonight. It's a lot better than a rock in your head. See you next time.